So thank you for your interest in the nexus between food and climate change. All of these very brilliant women on the stage believe that there is a strong connection between those two things, and we're going to spend a little while talking about that intersection point. Sound good? All right, so we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of doing the usual sort of call and response down the panel, we're going to do a live debate for y'all. Mix it up a little bit. It's WCL, so let's have some fun. Okay, so the way this is going to work is each panelist is going to introduce themselves briefly. They'll spend about 5 minutes talking about specifically the nexus between food and climate from the perspective of their particular focus area. And then after that, we'll have a series of kind of declarative statements. And then the panelists will have an opportunity to debate them. So I, of course, was a debater in high school and college. Big surprise. And so the format is going to be a declarative statement, and then you guys can choose if you'd like to do the affirmative or the negative, or you'd like to offer a nuance on the statement. Mm-hmm. That sound good? I think we'll have some fun. You guys don't, it doesn't feel like you think that's fun. I think it's fun? Okay. All right, so let's start with our introductions. And again, it's just about 5 minutes on, the nexus from your perspective. So let's get started with Lana first.
Okay, can you hear me okay? So just a quick introduction. I work within the youth climate movement, and I also work within advocating for more plant-based options, and specifically I'm passionate about how food relates to climate. So as a young person within the momentum of the youth climate movement, I am Deputy Director for Partnerships at 0 Hour, which means that I manage the work that we do within an international climate justice organization with other organizations and other campaigns. And then aside from that, also am an advisory board member at PlantBased Partnerships and the outreach director for National Children's Campaign. So really talking about youth issues, plant-based food systems, and food and climate. And I recently had the opportunity around 2 months ago to speak at the United Nations about food and climate. And I think that was another really important thing for me, just touching on the massive contributions of the industrial agricultural system, of factory farming systems, and how that really needs to be included in our climate solutions and within the climate movement, especially as young leaders within the advocacy that we're doing. For example, on September 20th, the youth climate strike that happened across the world, I was one of the main organizers within 0 Hour, and then even from the start of March 2019, when we first got the United States involved in the school strikes for climate movement, just making sure to really advocate for, there's so much consumer demand for talking about these healthier, more sustainable options, and that's been acknowledged more and more within reports, even recently from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, saying that these are the healthier, more sustainable options that we need to shift towards in order to mitigate climate. So just making sure that we're talking about that within youth leadership, within the efforts that we're doing when we're standing up for climate solutions and for action. Increasingly, that large mobilization is something that I'm really passionate about and that I have personally been advocating and still working on to make sure that that's being included.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your work, Lana. All right, Lisa, take it away.
Great. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm kind of losing my voice. My name is Lisa Archer, and I direct the Food and Agriculture Program at Friends of the Earth US. Friends of the Earth is the US voice of the world's largest network of environmental groups. We're in 76 countries around the world. And one of the core issues that our network is focused on is the climate crisis. And a lot of attention has really been paid to, of course, the energy and fossil fuel industry's contribution to the climate emergency, but food has been largely to the sidelines until recently. But what we know about the climate crisis is that one of the critical pieces where it intersects with the food system is that a lot of the most vulnerable industries and sectors of our economy to the climate crisis are food and agriculture, and some of the most vulnerable and highly impacted communities are farmers and producers and food chain workers and farm workers in rural communities that are already being impacted. For example, we've seen in the Midwest with recent intense flooding that actually kept farmers from planting their crops. We've seen heat waves that are impacting farm workers and the production of the food system. So we are seeing that our food system is incredibly vulnerable. We are vulnerable as eaters to future food security challenges, and then particularly farmers, farm workers, food chain workers, and fishers as well are highly impacted, and particularly those who are already on the edge when it comes to Trump's trade war and other factors that are influencing producers and communities. And industrial ag is, of course, also a critical driver and contributor to the climate crisis in terms of greenhouse gases. A lot of, excuse me, a lot of you in the room are fighting factory farms. Well, those are also a key contributor and an unregulated contributor to long-lasting greenhouse gases like methane. You also have nitrous oxides and carbon dioxide produced by industrial agriculture. So the ag system as we have it now, the highly consolidated corporate-controlled ag system, is a big contributor to the climate crisis. And simultaneously, agriculture and food offer huge solutions to the climate crisis. One, we know that through shifting our production practices towards regenerative and organic systems, we not only make our food system more resilient to climate change, we also have co-benefits of sequestering carbon in the soil if done right, reducing the use of industrial inputs, chemical pesticides and fertilizers, which are problematic for so many reasons, increasing biodiversity, which we have a twin crisis with the climate crisis of the biodiversity and extinction crisis, which goes hand in hand with industrial agriculture as a key driver. So we have multiple solutions, but we need to shift the policies to help farmers and help producers create a just transition in that sector that is also going to address a lot of the other problems of this sector that a lot of you talked about in this room today. And simultaneously, that's on the production side, we also need to be addressing consumption, and this is something we just talked a little bit about, and it is often sort of the elephant in the room, so to speak. Like, folks don't want to talk about how we can be shifting diets as well. And we know the science is very clear on this. We cannot feed the growing world population, particularly in high consuming countries, a heavy meat and dairy diet and have a stable climate in the future. And so how do we do this? We can't just go tell people what to eat, but we do have a huge amount of procurement, public procurement, institutional procurement that can start to make it easier and healthier for us to shift towards more plant-strong diets and towards more less sustainably produced, or less and better sustainably produced meat and dairy from regenerative producers and small family farmers. So what's great about the food system and climate and that intersection is there's so many solutions that solve to multiple problems in our society. And so a couple of examples of how Friends of the Earth approaches this in our US work. One, we helped to organize a letter to Congress around how food should be addressed in any Green New Deal, and that had been largely left out of the conversation up to this point. And so there are 300 groups that generated this letter and policy recommendations that we want to see in anything legislative to address the climate crisis, because we do need systemic shifts in policy. I can speak more to that in the panel. But then the other thing is that we were looking at institutional procurement. And for example, we work in K through 12 schools all over the country. There are $16 billion spent on the National School Food Program, serving 7 billion meals a year. And we also have a huge childhood obesity and health crisis. And so by shifting towards healthy, sustainable, plant-based foods, we can not only save money, we did a study that showed you can save greenhouse gases, save water, and save school districts money that they can then redirect towards good food. So those are just a couple of examples, and I look forward to continuing the discussion with you all.
That was really beautifully put, Lisa. Thank you. All right, Anna.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if the mic... Okay, great. So I'm Anna Levy, and I've had the pleasure, actually, of working with the Government Accountability Project as an international research fellow on a number of projects spanning over about a year and a half. My background is in transnational accountability politics inside complex institutions, cross-border issues where sort of legal jurisdiction isn't really isolated to one country. And in addition to that, I spent a lot of time in Central American countries and Mexico working with, or really just learning from agrarian social movements that have been, have had a lot of their land sort of contaminated, water systems contaminated, monocultivation has destroyed a lot of producers' ability to grow, indigenous land rights have been compromised over many years, NAFTA contributed greatly to that, especially in Mexico. And I was had B. Edwards, who's somebody emeritus at Gap, actually took a risk on me a couple years back through a grant funded by Getulio Carvalho to do some work that I had been trying to get funded for almost 7 years. But as we all know, and as we've all learned, whistleblower work is extremely sensitive and nobody wants to touch it. And so the work that I was doing was related to whistleblowing at the UN. After that project, given the background that I had sort of in Central America and Mexico on, at the intersection of food systems, human rights, and increasingly on climate, because that's clearly in the mix now, I learned something that I know we've heard a number of times actually today already, but I hadn't realized was as true as it was until this morning, that Amanda is incredibly visionary in how she's been approaching the work that she has been doing at Gap. So thank you. Amanda kind of reached out and said, look, we're trying to do more work at the intersection of food, climate, and accountability questions. Let's work on something together. So just a thank you to Amanda for having that vision, bringing me in, letting me be a part of it. And what we ended up focusing on, or sort of what I ended up working on with Gap along those lines, landed at the intersection of global agribusiness and global agribusiness, climate change, and what kinds of accountability questions you might even begin to ask. Whistleblowing is one very, very useful tool and instrument, but when you get into palm oil supply chains, for example, that go from Brazil to Indonesia to Liberia, right? You have human rights questions, you have land conflict related questions, then you get into the effects of climate change. So now we're talking effects on climate refugees coming up through the Sahel, on people who are being displaced in Southern California, and the list goes on. Whistleblowing is one key piece of this, but there's a lot of other stuff working there. So one key part of the research was looking at the most recent, sort of the second version of NAFTA that still has yet to be actually ratified by our Congress, and looking at trade documents and trade agreements as climate policy documents. So I'll talk a little bit more about that after. The second major area, which is in some ways more relevant to this conference, was actually looking at sort of doing a mapping, right? In terms of climate, we've looked a lot at big oil. We've looked a lot at big oil, and there's a lot less known about how the beef and cattle industry in general engages in terms of financial influence, lobbying in Washington and federal agencies. We know there's a lot of data on the big sort of cattle industry association actors, but there's really not a lot of data, for example, on one major part of beef and cattle industry supply chains that have consolidated enormously over the past 20 years, and that's mega feedlots. How do they engage in Washington? What is their sort of financial influence in Washington? So I'll talk a little bit about some of the key changes in the industry over the past 20 years, and where you can all also find more information on that, which is at opensecrets.org. They have an incredible data portal. It's run by the Center for Responsive Politics, and it's just massive troves of information on who lobbies whom for what every year. It's really an incredible resource. So let me just, I think that I will, I'm going to stop there, and I'll weigh in a little bit more when we do the debate.
Thank you. That was very provocative. Awesome. Sujatha.
Thank you so much. So my name is Sujatha Bergen. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thanks so much to GAP for having me here today. I'm very excited to be part of the conversation with these exciting colleagues who we don't get enough chance to come together and talk about these important issues. So the Natural Resources Defense Council, we're a national environmental group. We also have offices in China, India, and a few other countries. We have a staff of about 700 scientists, attorneys, policy experts, organizers, communication specialists, and we work on every environmental issue under the sun. We have known about the contributions of agriculture to environmental degradation for a long time and have been working on it from various angles. But I think the nexus between agriculture and climate change is one that is definitely rising in profile internally at NRDC, and then also in commensurate with the profile of this nexus externally as well. So I think folks, folks may be already familiar with the United Nations, the recent reports from I always forget what it stands for, IPCC.
National Intergovernmental
Thank
Panel
you.
on Climate
Which in two major reports just called for a significant shift in our diets in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Accord and other critical climate pollution objectives. And this was also at the same time we had the Lancet medical journals come out with a few reports of their own, also calling for a similar shift in diet. So it's exciting. We have, I think for the first time, a consensus from the medical and scientific community that diet shift is a critical piece of the climate, needs to be a critical piece of the climate strategy. And that's what I spend my time doing. I head up NRDC's Climate Healthy Menus project, and we work to shift consumption and production in agriculture in order to help achieve our climate objectives. And I mean, in part because of where NRDC sits in the spectrum of what groups are doing, and also because we think it's very powerful, we are less focused on individual behavior change, although that is great and should happen. We're also, though, primarily focused on the contribution of systems, our political system and our institutions to the overconsumption of climate-intensive foods in our society. So some examples of this skewed or warped, or however you want to talk about it, system is that, for example, federal subsidies for food in this country are vastly shifted towards meat production, and only a fraction of what goes towards subsidizing feed crops, for example, goes towards subsidizing produce crops. So that's an example of a systemic problem that we'd like to tackle. Others are menus that are served by institutions. So I actually am running a campaign along with my colleagues and other members of the environmental community, including Friends of the Earth, targeting the food service industries to shift their menus. Aramark, Sodexo, and Compass are the number 2, 3, and 4 sellers of meals in the country. Nobody knows. People don't know that. Only McDonald's sells more meals than the food service companies. And they're vulnerable in that they have lots of clients on college campuses and hospitals and institutions that have a vested interest in tackling climate change, yet they continue to serve menus that are perpetuating the problem of climate change. So they've been the target of many efforts to work to shift their menus away from red meat and other climate-intensive foods and towards plants. And then the third example of systemic change that we're interested in is the dietary guidelines. So I think we're going to get into this in more detail later in the panel, but the current dietary guidelines process is probably the only thing that may be some sort of a uniting document for Americans when it comes to what should we eat. Unfortunately, the dietary guidelines process and the resulting publications don't reflect the urgency of climate change when it comes to our health, or really the holistic approach to health that we think of when we think about what should we eat. They don't include sustainability. They don't include worker health, and even to the extent that they include nutrition, there's a big critique that it's very much heavily, overly influenced by industry as well. So we're also interested in shifting because the dietary guidelines, because apparently 1 in 4 Americans eats meals that are influenced directly by the federal programs that are dictated by the dietary guidelines. So I recently learned that stat, and it's really surprising to me. So it's that's an important lever as well that we're interested in influencing. So that's our meat reduction work. I would be remiss to not mention the work of my other colleagues in NRDC around this issue. So we also work on the issue of food waste. We waste about 40% of the food that we produce, and that takes a ton of greenhouse gas. That's a lot of unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions. It's the #1 contributor of waste to our landfills, and it's a huge contributor of methane. So we're working in cities to reduce emissions. We also work on organics, which, as Lisa mentioned, will help. The production of pesticides and fertilizer that's used on our feed crops is made possible through fossil fuels. And so if we can shift increasingly to organics, then that will be take a big chunk out of the emissions from agriculture. And then finally, we also work on agriculture from the solutions vantage point because, again, as was mentioned, the agriculture is among the most vulnerable industries to climate change, and as such, the stakeholders could be potentially a huge source of power in enacting solutions. And if we were able to really harness the potential of agriculture, I think I just saw an estimate earlier today that we could sequester about 10% of man-made emissions in agricultural soil if we were to improve farming practices, use cover crops, no-till. There's a bunch of different strategies that could be used. So we have a whole project that's working on those solutions as well. So look forward to talking more about these and excited for the debate to come.
I'm feeling pretty fired up about this debate squad. What do you guys think? This is going to be awesome. Okay, so just to remind everyone, this is the way it's going to go. I'm going to share the declarative statement. It's an affirmative statement. So you can choose either to affirm it, refute it, or to nuance it. But in any case, your argument can only be 2 minutes. And we can have multiple affirmations if we want, if you guys believe in it. And in other great news, the statements all align with the questions that I'm getting from the audience. So I think we're really in for a provocative conversation. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a head start on this first one. I'm going to give you the statement, and then I'm going to introduce myself quickly to give you guys time to prepare and think about your arguments. It's the only time you're going to get extra time because it's the first one. All right, fair? Here we go. So we're definitely going to get to policy recommendations and systemic change, but we're going to start this debate with how we can reduce our personal carbon footprint, individual level change. So the first statement is, eating a plant-centric diet is the single most impactful thing you can do on a daily basis to minimize your personal carbon footprint. Everybody hear that? All right, so you guys think about it. I'm Danielle Vogel. I graduated from WCL in 2007. I spent 10 years working on Capitol Hill for Democrats, Republicans, and Joe Lieberman. I worked, yeah. He was wacky on a lot of stuff, but awesome on climate change. So I spent 10 years working to pass national climate legislation. We all know that did not work out. After a decade of beating my head against the wall, I decided to channel the power of my community to make incremental climate change progress. And I opened a grocery store in DuPont Circle called Glenn's Garden Market. So the idea is that every single decision we make for the business is made with the environment in mind, but that doesn't necessarily matter to our neighbors. All they have to do is walk through the doors, and every single decision they make is implicitly climate progressive. So some people are attracted to it for the climate mission, and some people just shop there because it's convenient, and frankly, it doesn't matter much to us. We do things like almost everything on the shelves are sourced from the states of the Chesapeake Bay watershed to minimize transportation and refrigeration emissions. We have drastically but subliminally encouraged plant-based eating by putting the vegan and vegetarian options at the top of the menu, by reducing or eliminating meat from many of our main dishes and offerings. We responsibly waste stream, so we have landfill, but also recycling and compost, and we invite the community to compost with us for free in unlimited quantities. We're a grocery store that doesn't have paper or plastic bags. That's pretty weird for a grocery store, but we only use reusables to try to, again, change behavior. And then most impactfully, over the 7 years that we've been around, we've launched 89 local small food businesses, giving 89 producers their first chance to sell on our shelves. Of those 89, 55 of those companies are owned by women, and 23 were started by people of color. So it really is a community of like-minded producers working together to displace demand for industrially produced food. All right, I bought you guys some time. Let's get to the debate. So the first declarative is eating a plant-centric diet is the single most impactful thing you can do on a daily basis to minimize your personal carbon footprint. Where WCL, I will cold call if I don't get a volunteer. Sujatha.
I'd like to make an argument for the resolution. So we apparently make 200 food decisions a day, and by lunch, it's not 90 of them have been made. So livestock production is responsible for about 15% of emissions globally. And so in terms of numbers, it's a big number. You could argue that there are other sectors that are bigger. But I would argue that in your personal life, there's probably nothing we think about more than food, apparently. And so just the opportunities to make shifts are enormous. And we talk about it like, so instead of figuring out a different way to get to work, which might be difficult, you can actually just fight climate change by changing what you're picking up with your fork, which is really exciting. And there's a stat that we like to use, which is that if Americans on average cut about the equivalent of a burger a week from their diet, it would be like taking 10 million cars off the road. So
I can tell you were a debater.
Yeah, that's my pitch.
You didn't even know what the resolution's called.
Yeah.
I have a nuance, which I think builds off of what Sujatha just said, which is you don't have to go full vegan. It's great if you are, but really if you can go towards flexitarianism, which is what I kind of do these days, which is to eat less meat and dairy, right? Particularly industrial produced meat and dairy, you can have a huge impact. And what's really exciting is that the next generation, the millennials, the Gen Z, and even Gen Alpha. There's a new generation after Z, thank God. They're not the last. Gen Alpha, who are the young kids, are actually choosing more plant-based foods, which is dramatically shifting the market. And this, of course, has knock-on effects on the dairy industry. So it speaks to why we do, like many dairy farmers are in crisis for various reasons, but it does speak to the need for a just transition in our food system as well as this is happening. But we do see that individual choices are actually manifesting a shift in the market and hopefully eventually in policy as well.
Please. Anna.
Yeah, I guess I'll take the controversial line, which is to refute it on the premise that the beef and cattle production industry in the U.S. has almost doubled in the past 20 years, and it's not necessarily because people in the United States are eating that much more. It's because the export market has grown tremendously. And so I want to push back on this idea that individual choices will eventually kind of transform the market, which is this thing that will always bend in the right direction on its own if we just ask it to do so in a better way. So, for example, in the Trade and Environmental Policy Committee in the new, one of the key advisory committees that wasn't composed of corporations in the passage of the USMCA or in the writing of the text last fall, in their final report that they published in September 2018, they were restricted in scope to, quote, to ensure that trade agreements do not establish obligations for the United States regarding greenhouse gas emissions measures, including obligations that require changes to United States law or regulations that would affect the implementation of such laws or regulations, other than those fulfilling the other negotiating objectives in this section. So we have a really, really big challenge ahead of us that goes so much further than individual consumer choices in the United States. And so I just want to, that's the part of it that I want to push back on. It raises a lot of ethical questions when you go internationally. People will say, look, you all got to kind of modernize and industrialize, and now it's our turn. And so I think this idea of pushing on individual choices has some ramifications that both overlook the need for serious regulation and oversight of things like trade agreements, for example, which right now almost the entire process is governed by inputs from corporations. and has clauses like this in it that restrict what the Trade and Environmental Policy Advisory Committee can actually do.
So actually, I'd love to use that to pivot to the next one, which I have drafted, but it also comments we're hearing from the audience, which is, this one's coming straight to you, Anna. Trade agreements provide a ripe opportunity to achieve emissions reduction goals within the agriculture sector. What say you?
Yeah, I guess I would, I very much agree with that. And I would say one of the really big challenges is that everybody who played a role in putting together the text last fall. So there's an executive order from the 90s called, I'll find the, Executive Order 13141, which essentially mandates that an environmental impact review is done as part of drafting the text for any international trade agreement. The US Trade Representative has barred the inclusion of anything climate related in this environmental impact review. So the advisory committee that's tasked with doing that environmental impact review, it's the same one I just mentioned, actually can't do any sort of climate-based, whether it's emissions or otherwise, no climate-based calculations. So no quantification of emissions that come from expanding industry, which is really just simple math. I mean, many other countries do that in their negotiation of trade agreements, but we're actually not allowed to do it. It raises interesting questions for Canada and Mexico because they can do it. They're a lot more progressive on these topics, but that kind of calculation hasn't been done for the USMCA. So we have this document that's going to govern trade policy for probably 4 or 5 or 6 administrations, as the last one did. It's going to set the framework for, well, let's just say the last NAFTA set the framework for over 100 other trade agreements. So we have a real opportunity now, but climate calculations as corresponding to the expansion of, corresponding to industrial expansion are essentially barred at this point. I think we have a real opportunity to intervene before it gets ratified. One of the other pieces of that, for example, is procedural. The same advisory committee, the Trade and Environmental Policy Committee, they have 30 days to do due diligence on all the kind of cost benefit, environmental impact and cost benefit in this trade text. The 30 days begins before the final text is even drafted. And included in sort of the cost, I would say, is not just the amount of emissions, but we need to start including things like public health costs, rising disaster assistance cost from climate change, along with actual just emissions calculations. So yes, I fully agree, but we have a lot of work to do before that can happen.
Sujatha.
Yeah, Anna is the trade treaty expert on the panel, and I'm not going to even pretend to approach that level of expertise. But I would like to actually agree and further support the statement that it is a global problem that we face with consumption. And if we do succeed in reducing demand in the United States, which we are focused on because we actually do eat the most meat in the world right now, by far. And we don't think that we should be, as Americans who have exported fast food diets all over the world, heading to other countries and saying, you know, don't eat meat. So we are focused on the United States, but we do think that rising demand around the world needs to be addressed as well. Ultimately, there is indication that there is momentum in other parts of the world. So the Chinese government actually has set a red meat consumption reduction goal, in part in response to rising levels of chronic disease. They have a big diabetes problem, in which they don't want to see get worse. I think they're also worried about supplying that much meat to a growing population as well. And the Brazilian dietary guidelines, Brazil is one of the biggest exporters of beef in the world. It's one of the reasons for the destruction of the Amazon that we're seeing. But their dietary guidelines are actually quite progressive when it comes to red meat. So there is momentum globally that we would love to harness. And I'm very excited that people like Anna are in there helping to make sure that the trade agreements are reflecting those priorities.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak to trade agreements for ag climate progress. All right. I want to engage you, Lana. So we're gonna take it in that direction. All right, here's the next resolution. We should be focusing a tremendous amount of energy on the youth-led climate movement because it's starting to gain the political attention that could build traction for action.
Wow, that wasn't aimed towards me at all. Surprisingly, I really want to affirm that. Yeah, definitely. When we're looking at all of the momentum that in the mainstream and in the media that the youth climate movement has gained, and especially, having the moral authority of young people and younger generations, as Lisa was saying, Generation Z, that this are going to be the disproportionately impacted population, that our futures are at risk, and that we're, basically telling people that we don't want to be called Generation Z, the last generation. That kind of message and that kind of momentum as far as standing up really gives us the opportunity to increasingly not only talk about fossil fuel industries and the corporations in fossil fuels, but also animal agricultural industries are increasingly part of even the global demands. When we had the September 20th strikes, one of them was around sustainable agriculture. And we are increasingly in 0 Hour as an international organization in different countries talking about now the corporations and especially the industrial producers as far as how intention emissions heavy that is, and we've mentioned that before. And I think that increasingly having more partnerships, as that is the area I mainly work with, really working together and bridging all of the amazing work that is already being done and all of the research that already exists for people who have been working in this area, and then the new momentum of really a passionate generation that has been gaining more vision in that. I think that's really powerful, and I think that's a direction we should move in.
Awesome. All right, do we have either snaps or words of caution or wisdom?
I have a nuance. I don't think it's fair, actually, that we put it all on the youth. And I think Greta said it very well. How dare you?
Yeah.
How dare you put it all on my generation to solve the crisis that your previous generations have entrenched and failed to solve? So it is incumbent upon all of us to support the youth movement, as well as center and lift up the voices of those most highly impacted by the climate crisis, who are actually creating solutions and need to be consulted, and that when we craft policies to address the climate crisis, they will not be successful, and they won't really address the crisis, and they won't be just or equitable if we don't lift up those voices as architects of any climate policies we put forward. And I think we have real opportunities and momentum. We also need to build an intersectional, broad-based movement that is representative of the many voices that need to actually be brought together to create the momentum for policy change that we need to solve this crisis.
Anna, it looked like you had some thoughts? No? Good. Thank you.
I will just say it's a nuance of gratitude actually to this generation for putting so much attention on money in politics. 3 times as much was spent in the 2018 congressional election by beef and cattle industry as was spent in 2012. 2016, almost twice as much was spent in lobbying from 2012 and 2008. And so I just want to shout out to the movement that you're a part of, which I very much agree, the burden of solving the climate crisis should not be your burden alone, but I have a lot of respect and gratitude for the fact that the movement that you're a part of has really been taking on this money in politics question in a different way.
Certainly. Okay, now as for something slightly more controversial, then thank you to the youth movement. The production of plant-based foods is always better for the environment than the production of animal-derived proteins. Can we talk about the Impossible Burger?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to focus it just there. So I think there are a lot of incredible plant-based alternatives that are entering the market, and it speaks to the shift in demand. It speaks to trying to find solutions to the climate crisis and the multiplicity of problems associated with industrial agriculture and factory farming, which is all very good. And given that we have 11 years to truly address the climate crisis, and who knows how long we have to address the extinction crisis, the pollinator crisis, the insect apocalypse that go hand in hand with industrial agriculture, we need to be actually really careful about what solutions we put forward and really examine them closely. And so, yes, plant-based foods are generally have a lower carbon footprint, but we also need to look at what systems are we putting in place that will grow and will really define the food system of the future. And some folks want to produce our food in vats and with engineered microbes that haven't really gone through any safety assessment that could cause ecological problems or health issues because we have so little government oversight and we have so much corporate capture, as a lot of you have seen in your work, and so little transparency for consumers. And so, the question is, shouldn't we put forward the best and least risky solutions when we're also moving towards plant-based diets? And also, shouldn't we be putting forward the healthiest whole food, plant-based solutions that we can, particularly, when we're talking about shifting school food, which, people want real food. They want to know what they're eating. They want to know that they're also supporting sustainable farmers and a better form of agriculture. So I would say, yes, we need to move towards plant-based, but we really need to look at the production side and ideally be putting forth healthy plant-based foods that is assessed for safety and where people actually know what they're eating and where it's coming from.
So you want to debate? We have, not a hugely different, but somewhat different position, NRDC, on these plant-based alternatives. So the plant-based alternatives, let's talk about the conventional burger specifically as an example. There's a whole range of alternatives from, the kind of black bean burger that you've been able to buy for 30 years and anyway, that. And then range to the Impossible Burger, which has kind of taken the market by storm recently, most recently on Burger King's menus, and there's the subject of national ads. I actually think it's a good thing to have a range of options for people, and I think it is actually good that Burger King is running ads saying, here's this Impossible Burger, and it's very glamorous, and eat it because it's really cool. And so I think where the danger is I think similar to, slightly different, but similar to what Lisa was saying, is when that's embraced as the whole solution to our problems. So I think it's a step in the right direction. It's a step towards lower carbon, lower resource foods, but it is not the whole solution. It doesn't solve the problem of monoculture, for example. So the Impossible Burger is using genetically engineered soy crops, which are produced in the same way and are responsible for the same climate unfriendly practices that are fueling this whole problem. So that's one example. Also, these are not like local farmers who are producing the peas, and we're not building up local regional economies around our food. Increasingly, the large food players like Tyson, for example, are investing in these companies, so we're not necessarily challenging this whole idea of consolidation of the food industry and who has the power and who's making the money. It's not like the workers are making the money when an Impossible Burger gets sold. So I think it's a first step. We encourage it. We don't want to be the people like wagging our fingers and telling people not to buy the Impossible Burger, but we would encourage people to think beyond those solutions.
Not just Beyond Meat.
Right, I was going to say, which is non-GMO.
That's a good soundbite, actually.
So, Sujatha, I know we're going to lose you in about 5 minutes' time, so I just want to give you one more chance to affirm a resolution, pivoting off some stuff I know you care about. So if we are to focus on consumption side policy, dietary guidelines are our best policy option.
Yeah, I think, yes. I think the dietary guidelines, like I said when I was in my introduction, are probably the only single thing that Americans look to when they're thinking about what is good for me to eat, and they influence what 1 in 4 Americans eat as well. So I directly through federal food programs like WIC, SNAP, USD, the school lunch program, and other food programs. So they're incredibly influential. I actually, just before this, went through, so they're revised every 5 years. There's a science panel that's commissioned to look at the updated science, and then they send recommendations to USDA and HHS to come up with a final document. And historically, the regulatory process has basically just taken the recommendations of the science panel. Unfortunately, that was totally upended last time around in 2015 when the science panel actually recommended a significant reduction in red meat consumption due to both health and sustainability concerns, climate change concerns. And it just freaked industry out completely. And we ended up, not only did USDA, under the Obama administration, lest you think this is a partisan issue, under the Obama administration, they ignored those recommendations, and there were riders in Congress that passed to say that the dietary guidelines could never consider sustainability moving forward. And then this time, there's so much paranoia that the Science Advisory Committee has been significantly hampered. And I just looked at a list of some of the industry folks on there. So there are two people that have consulted with the National Cattlemen's Association. There's representatives from Burger King and General Mills, the American Beverage Association, the Sugar Association, Nestle. So it's very industry dominated. And they, not only that, but they have been very limited in what questions they can address. So we are interested in challenging the notion that the dietary guidelines should be A, captured by industry, and then B, only looking at the specific macronutrients that we ingest, but should be looking at health from a holistic perspective. And there's no reason that it should be so limited. And so we are working on an effort we'll be releasing a report and working in coalition with a whole bunch of partners to make the argument that we should be, if we're going to hold up the dietary guidelines as a document that points Americans to what they should eat, it really should point Americans to what they should eat. So that is my...
Okay, so I want to go to Anna for what I know she's going to make a beautiful argument about the relationship between the cattle industry and the dietary guidelines. But first, let's just thank Sujatha because she's got to head out.
Yeah, thank you very much.
What is the declarative statement?
No, we're still on the same subject, but I saw you scribbling away. I thought you were preparing an argument maybe about the cattle industry.
No, if that's why you're calling on me, no, I'm just taking the chance also to learn from my colleagues. So I was just taking notes.
All right, does anyone else want to speak to dietary guidelines?
Can you repeat? Oh, it's just the dietary guidelines?
Yeah,
or-
we can move to the next.
Well, I would just like to nuance and say that there's other really incredible policy opportunities to address the climate crisis.
We will get to
with the
this,
food
I
system.
promise.
Okay, well then I will shut my mouth and we'll move on.
All right, so we have one more debate topic, and then we're all going to stand up and then sit back down, and then the next sector is going to be just open-ended questions, and then finally we're going to do questions from you guys, if that works. All right, so the last debate topic, from a policy perspective, we should focus on production side solutions because it's too hard to convince people to change their consumption habits.
I'm happy to speak to that. I think we have to address both. If we simply address the production side, we will not ever catch up with the fact that there is massive overconsumption of industrial animal products, which have a huge climate footprint in the US and around the world, particularly in high-consuming countries. And if we only address the consumption part, we're not going to address industrial ag's massive contributions to the crisis.
Agreed. Any other panelists want to speak to that? Consumption versus production side approaches?
I mean, oh, I'm sorry, were you gonna?
Please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll add a little bit. I mean, they're related, obviously, like as far as what consumers are, choosing to eat will end up affecting like what the industry is, supported by that. So I think obviously that's very related. We definitely have to also talk about consumption, even if that means, not patronizing people or saying that they have to eat a certain way, but I think it's very, very important that we talk about making sure that these options are available to people and that there's been increasing policy about, especially within areas like hospitals and within schools and within like venues and within city and other levels, that making sure that these options are there for consumption is, I think, a very critical area and something that we've been talking about in my work as well.
Good point. Anna, anything?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, building on what they've both said, they're obviously both important, but they're also, production side seems more like a regulatory oversight question, issue, and consumption side has, for me at least, more of a, an awareness raising, campaigning, public education side to it. And just on the production side, I mean, going to beef and cattle, for example, I do think that it's also really important to recognize that these industries, I mean, it's obvious, but they're not static. They don't look the same over time. I'll just read a quick, Pinnacle Asset Management, which is this asset management firm based in New York City, purchased a mega feedlot from JBS for $200 million with almost 1 million cattle in it. And I think, 10, 15 years ago, that would have been outer space. It would have been sort of an alternative universe. And so one thing that I want to just emphasize on the production side is the dynamic nature of how these industries are changing, specifically beef and cattle in the United States, consolidating, and what that actually means for how we think about regulating or putting pressure on production.
Okay. All right, we've been chatting for a while. Let's stand up for a sec. Revived. I'm feeling revived. Okay. Segment 2 is going to be a series of open-ended questions to the panelists, starting with whoever feels like answering. The question is, can you give us some policy recommendations for what food-based policy reform intended to achieve climate solutions should look like?
We have a whole bunch of those, but I think there are some critical levers that we should be implementing. One, I think farmers are disincentivized to practice basic conservation agriculture right now, and unfortunately, have been incentivized to really dial back and go backward instead of forward in terms of their use of conservation practices, driven by ethanol production, for example, planting hedgerow to hedgerow, and that's had huge consequences. So, tying, and this may or may not be popular, but, tying crop insurance to conservation compliance could be one simple tool without cutting subsidies, which we know is a difficult fight in the next Farm Bill, could be one way of doing it. I think shifting the dietary guidelines, that's a critical one. Through our Green New Deal letter that we created, there is a series of policy recommendations that could, address the climate crisis in the food system and foster just transition. And so I think, the shifting of subsidies, there also needs to be massive support for farmers to shift their practices towards regenerative and organic practices and do cover cropping and no-till and things like that. Reduce their fertilizer use, which is also a big contributor to the climate crisis. We also need to stop, incentivizing grain production, which is really what makes cheap meat cheap, aside from not actually enforcing any regulations around factory farms. And so we need to stop, incentivizing the growth of industrial factory farms. We also need to regulate factory farm pollution. This sector is completely unregulated in terms of methane production, et cetera. And, this may or may not be popular in this room, but we actually think things like incentivizing methane digesters on factory farms, that locks in those factory farms as a source of clean energy, right? And so there's all sorts of policy solutions at the state and federal level we need to be implementing. A lot of farmers we've talked to have talked about price parity and supply management as a critical solution because we really are incentivizing overproduction in this system. So those are a few of the pieces. Also fair prices for farmers and fair wages for workers. That's a critical piece of the solution because we do need good jobs as well to come out of this. And then I think also at the consumption level, I think we really need to support and foster through federal procurement. Even if we looked at the Defense Department, they're one of the largest procurers of food globally. They have actually been interested in moving towards plant-based diets. The same thing with school food. So there's a huge array of federal programs as well as state-level programs and even at the school district level that could be shifted to get us in the right direction.
Totally. Lana, are you policy agnostic?
I'll add a little bit. I think Lisa already covered a good amount, and I think we've been talking about, for example, dietary guidelines, subsidies, really specific things, I think, throughout the entire panel. But yeah, I think another area that we touched on a little bit is, in general, climate policies should also acknowledge food and acknowledge, production and consumption and how, food should be tied in within things like the Green New Deal or climate emergency resolution or any kind of climate policy, making sure that's included somewhere in there. And then also, I think I mentioned a little bit, like on the local level, making sure that in the same way that we're asking for example, venues to not have like plastic straws or not use like plastic bags, we should also be ensuring that like plant-based options and vegetarian options are available to people, for example, when they go to the hospital or something like that. So within like both including that food in larger climate policies and then like specific policies on like the local and federal level that can be made.
Said that quickly, but it was a really good point. Food in hospitals is like a major entry point for some improvement, major improvement here. Anna, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess just, a plug for the work that GAP does, though, which has high relevance in the, in negotiating international trade agreements, is there really are no protections for whistleblowers from other countries in the process. So I think actually working on whistleblower legislation that protects people who are insiders in trade negotiations is one. A second big one just on the trade front is actually doing kind of a full review of whether or not the process adhered to its own mandatory components. So if an environmental impact review was supposed to be done under this executive order and it wasn't done for any number of reasons, that this can, right now it doesn't actually, there are no policy considerations that create barriers to its passage based on this premise. So actually maybe this is more of a legal argument and less of a policy argument. So I'll move away from that one. But the other one is the federal government is not going to do very much in terms of doing sort of a climate calculation or emissions calculation assessment in NAFTA. And so I think state governments have some interesting, like state level policies, I think going to be a really interesting lever on this front in terms of both sort of boycotts and also in terms of doing some of the calculations to see whether the agreement actually aligns with state laws and policies.
That last point really lands with me because when I was at the Department of Justice as an environmental litigator, it was during the Bush administration and we weren't allowed to use the word pollution when we were enforcing the Clean Air Act. So certainly this current Congress is not likely to include trade agreement language that's going to affirm a climate progressive perspective. Okay, so I have one last question, then we're going to get to the audience for the last 15 minutes. I'm going to force every one of you to answer. What are your personal strategies or pieces of advice that you can share for reducing our personal carbon footprint?
As individuals. So I didn't get to touch on this earlier, but I do affirm the statement that, as an individual person, aside from getting involved with like systemic change with food systems, either through like working within one of these efforts or donating or supporting one of those, like as a person, there's not really something that we interact with as far as sustainability and our climate impact as much as we do like sit down to eat 3 times a day and choose to make a more sustainable decision every single day of our lives. So I definitely affirm that statement, with the nuance that we can like fight for these larger issues as we are all involved in. And yeah, personally, I follow a plant-based diet, which is, something that also talking about have been personally involved in just how much we can sequester, for example, carbon through like moving towards more plant-based, and the more plant-rich of the food system it is. We mentioned a little bit earlier, for example, how moving towards the IPCC report talked about like really that shift towards plant-based systems and how that can have so much more of an impact than like the Eat Lancet diet. There was a study that looked at the difference in how much carbon was sequestered for eating like a meat light diet versus the more you shift towards plant-based in the food system, the more that has like that impact that we can then buy ourselves more time to like look at into deeper climate solutions. And that's something that, personally in my own lifestyle have really, aside from other sustainability efforts, one of the main ones that we talk about, including in the movement, is how we can personally just moving towards that area and doing that as much as we can is really an enormous.
That's a good eat less meat.
Yeah, I agree with that, and definitely I try to practice what I preach in my daily life, and it's challenging with 2 small children, but There are veggie chicken nuggets as well. And I think, I agree the individual has a lot to do in their daily lives with their diet, but I mean, fundamentally, given the scale of systemic shift we need to be embracing to address this crisis in the time we have left, there is also that daily picking up of the phone to harass your congressperson. There is the daily engagement in the political process to be pushing for the change that's needed to address this crisis. So yes, eat your veggie burgers, become a flexitarian or vegetarian or a vegan. Eating less meat and dairy is critical to addressing so much of this climate crisis, as well as the other harms of industrial agriculture on our lives and our communities. But really, political engagement is core to achieve the systemic shift we need to, because this is a huge systemic problem and a political problem. So 2020 is coming up, and this is definitely in a lot of the presidential candidates' platforms now, food and agriculture and climate, which is just so encouraging to see. So I think that's a critical place to personally engage as well.
For sure. All right, so far we have eat less meat and activate daily. Bring us home, Anna.
I mean, actually, that's pretty much what I was going to say, so I second that.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you guys so much. And now to the audience. So we've gotten a ton of questions. A lot of them are quite thematic. So please don't be offended if I don't choose your exact language, but I'm trying to pick up questions from each theme we've heard so far. So what is the right answer to emerging economies who want their turn to modernize and grow their economy in spite of environmental ramifications? India, China, go.
Sure, I'll touch on that a little bit first, because I think when we're talking about like changing food systems and like meat reduction on an international level, something that we have done is talk about how the largest like historical emitters and also the largest like meat consumers, usually like the United States and other countries, have more responsibility in that. So like while the United States would have to decrease like their meat consumption or change their food systems so much more, we have more flexibility for like developing economies to maybe even increase that, as long as we're really focusing on measuring like the impact that's been done in like the more developed countries. So I think even within like fossil fuels, within like economy development and like food systems, we do allow like a lot of international solutions. We're talking about like internationally, like what we want to do, allowing more flexibility for like the developing countries to like understand that they haven't been the ones that have historically put us into the situation that we're in today, in the same way as the United States.
Lisa, do you have a thought on differentiating
Yeah, I
standards?
think to build on that in terms of historical contribution and different rates of consumption, I mean, Europe and the US have historically, and particularly now, consume amongst the highest levels. There's other countries as well that are responsible for, on the consumption side of meat and dairy. And then I think the other piece is that there are smallholder farmers that are practicing agroecology around the world that actually are innovating some of those incredible solutions. And unfortunately, because of many global corporations that are deciding that they want to be, expanding factory farming in places like Africa and in other places around the world, we're seeing those smallholder farmers and agroecologists, people who are practicing really sustainable forms of agriculture that are very climate friendly, being displaced by industrial agriculture. So I do think that's a critical place where we have to push back in this context, in terms of not perpetuating those systems in other places and displacing the real solutions that already exist. And we can also be learning from the agroecology movement abroad, which is also a social and political movement, which is, we're kind of behind in the US. We think about organic agriculture, which is sort of a political movement, but really we have a lot to learn from folks, around the world in terms of how to do this right.
Awesome. And Anna, this one's for you. In what ways can farmers be incentivized to implement regenerative agriculture practices like cover crops, no-till drills, et cetera?
So I will also talk about agroecology movements in Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, all over Brazil, South America actually are so much more advanced along these. I shouldn't say advanced, I mean they just, because the state hasn't functioned very well for a long time in a lot of these places, and corporations are quite relentless. Entire communities, transnational networks of people have created entirely alternative agricultural systems, building on those that sort of preceded the onset of large-scale monocultivation. I think I actually don't, I'm going to be honest, I don't know as much or enough about U.S. agricultural policy and what motivates or doesn't motivate farmers. But my understanding is actually it's not a question of incentivizing smaller family farms. I mean, they're really struggling now because of this consolidation, right? There's a monopoly on agriculture. I don't know if the question is really incentives for kind of family farmers as much as deterrence for large-scale agriculture to have as much influence as it does.
Okay, I just got a last question from the audience. We only have 5 minutes left. This one's a total bomb. I will tell you, I happen to be a climate-committed non-procreator. I have a feeling this person is too. So here's the comment. We've heard a lot about reducing meat consumption, but choosing not to procreate or having fewer children is a larger factor. Why no acknowledgement?
Because it was not how, I would say, because that's how the question was framed earlier. Like we're discussing a daily choice, and I guess not conceiving a child is sort of a daily choice for many of us. So that, I was going to mention that earlier. I do think that is probably amongst the most critical things you could do, particularly in high-consuming countries like the United States, to not have a kid. That said, I have 2 children. So I'm placing my bets on there being a livable future within the next 20 to 40 years. But we do try to reduce our consumption on other levels, but definitely not having more than 1 child or not having any children at all is definitely a piece of the puzzle, because those kids will go on to consume at high levels, and that feeds the climate crisis.
Awesome. Anybody else want to speak on that, Emily?
Yeah, just speaking on behalf of my generation, I think that's more and more becoming a reality where people are terrified for what the future will look like, and that's a change kind of thinking the millennial and Gen Z mindset as well. That's of course if we continue moving in this direction, it's another way that people will be changing their lifestyles aside from consumption.
All right, so speed round, last question, go down the row. Are we feeling hopeful or terrified?
I think, throughout history, people have really contended with so much more. I mean, in this country, the amount of social and political violence that so many people lived through the country's entire founding, and, how they overcame that, and we have all overcome that, makes me not feel like, this is the apocalypse. There's a lot to be fearful of, but I also take a lot of motivation and inspiration from social and political movements historically that have really faced all different kinds of really, really scary prospects to their collective existence, as we're all facing now.
I'd say both. Terrified, and I have a lot of hope. And I do feel like in moments of crisis, we as a species have in past risen to great heights and have innovated amazing solutions. And the solutions are actually really clear. We just have to build the political will and the movements to make those the reality. And so I am so hopeful, particularly, thank you, youth, as well as social movements around the world that are really connecting the dots. That the climate crisis is actually deeply connected with so many other societal issues and problems, from racism to, the massive wealth gaps we're seeing that are perpetuating this crisis, to fundamentally capitalism, that it is driving this crisis. And we have huge opportunities to reform these systems to bring about a healthier and more just world and a livable future. So there's the hope.
Lisa stole my answers. Going to say both as well. Very strongly both, definitely. But I think events like this give me hope, and we are definitely at a critical point right now where we could very much, we are acknowledging these systems that are at the forefront. When we say that these industrial food systems have massive contributions to climate, that means that they also offer massive potential as a climate solution and as a major way in which we could buy ourselves more time and start moving towards a more sustainable future. So the fact that we are acknowledging that now, and that we are starting to see a path forward, is very promising, and we have it in our means to really take that and move forward with it.
And I'll just close by saying we have a lot of very brilliant people, visionaries at the forefront of working on the policy solutions, but it is absolutely in our laps every single day to make mindful choices. The individual decisions really do have a significant cumulative impact over time, so please keep responsibly waste streaming, before reduce, reuse, and recycle comes refuse. Just don't choose to engage in plastic that's unnecessary. Reduce meat when you're able to do so, or skip it altogether if that's up your alley. But please do take personal responsibility for the climate crisis. If you don't, we're totally screwed. But in great news, we've got some really smart people working on it from the top level as well. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day.